Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ad Age's custom webcast sponsored by Podscribe. The topic of today's webcast is the ROI revolution, unlocking performance in podcast and streaming audio. My name is Natalie Zafat, and I am with the Ad Age team. I will be your moderator today. We have just a few quick items to go over before we begin. Shortly, we'll be hearing from today's presenters, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions. To participate in today's Q&A, all you have to do is type your question into the Ask a Question text area and click the Send button. You can submit questions at any time during today's webcast, and we will address as many as time permits after our presenters' prepared remarks. To get us started, please help me welcome Matt Drangler, Head of Partnerships at Podscribe, and Camden Weber, Senior Director of Partnerships at Podscribe. Matt, Cam, take it away.
Thank you, Natalie. Really appreciate being here alongside Cam. Very quick sort of background on Cam and myself. We've worked together at a couple of different places now. We maybe took some separate paths and now we're back together, kind of bringing the band back together. Cam, you want to talk a little bit about like some of your experience in the space?
Yeah, absolutely. No, you said it perfectly. The band is back together. Excited to be back with you now at Podscribe. But yeah, we really got started 7-8 years ago with the acquisition of Barometric and forging a path into pixel-based attribution. So for the past 8 years, for me personally, have been focused in audio attribution, and really just want to start off by saying thank you for helping take me under your wing, and excited to present today Podscribe's performance benchmarks and showcase some of the data that we've been building and compiling over the past several years, actually.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be working with you again. And, between the two of us, we've got almost 2 decades worth of experience in this stuff. So as we go through, we're going to talk through a whole bunch of insights that we have found through measurement of audio and podcast attribution. But also, if you got any other questions around podcasts, feel free to throw them out there in the question section, as Natalie had referenced. And we're more than happy to kind of go through all of those. To kick us off, let's talk a bit about what our agenda is here today. And we're going to go through a little bit of the state of audio ad measurement, kind of where things stand. We're going to introduce to you, for those of you that haven't heard, what the PPB report is. And it's, if you can guess what the acronym is before we pull that up, I'll be very excited. We'll talk a bit about the things that we've identified in terms of benchmarks and insights to kind of help advertisers and where maybe they want to focus. And we'll talk a bit about the key takeaways just to kind of wrap things up. And so that will be our agenda. Let's talk and start off a bit about the state of audio ad measurement. Generally speaking, audio advertising is very measurable, but there are still many advertisers out there that believe, sort of unmeasurable, it's unreliable, sometimes unusable in terms of the results that come in. We hear that all the time, especially in a world where, in a lot of places, folks believe that podcast advertising is sort of thought about as an offline medium. And from an offline medium perspective, that's when we start using things like coupons or vanity URLs or other calls to action that might be trackable. And that's how some people sort of ascribe the measurement or measurement capabilities within the podcast and streaming audio space. Unreliable too, you think about things like, can we rely on, let's say, media mix models to kind of help us understand what's going on in this space, especially if you want to look at things in an omni-channel view? And the unfortunate side about using that as a methodology is it takes time to aggregate those insights together. I remember in my days when I was running mobile measurement at Staples, and we would try to get a quarterly media mix model review. And that quarterly review came out on about a 6 or a 7 week lag. And now all of a sudden, like, how do I use that information to kind of adjust, let's say, my back to school strategy or tactics? And that's really challenging. So, we kind of think of things as unreliable. Unusable, I think everything that we just talked about is kind of maybe the summation of where some advertisers are kind of thinking that audio is in terms of its measurability. And I just want to call out there that we hear you. We understand sort of what marketers need. They need things to be more digital-like, right? We want to see things like real-time dashboards dashboard. We want pixel-based attribution. We want to be able to take that data and port it into various different places so we can see omni-channel views, much like we're already doing with, let's say, our Facebook spend or our online video spend or our paid search spend and so on and so forth. We believe truly that that is something that we've solved. One of the things that we're really proud of is that we are bringing pixel-based attribution into the podcast space. It's allowing advertisers that are buying there or looking to buy there to compare and contrast things in an apples to apples way with their other digital channels. It means we're able to compare things like, hey, my podcasts are running better than Facebook based on visitation rate, cost per visitor, cost per acquired customer, so on and so forth. It's allowing us to sort of open up the floodgates in terms of providing some more budget towards those line items, because we're starting to see a lot of great performance from podcasts and streaming audio. And super high level, the way that we're doing things like that is using pixels, capturing digital identifiers, much like we're used to seeing in some of those other digital channels, and then matching conversions with exposures in that way. Okay, if you got other thoughts you want to throw out there.
Yeah, I am always still surprised that in 2025, the surprise from advertisers that may be newer to the space of how measurable podcast is, because I would argue, and we'll get into some of the data that supports it, that podcast is one of the most measurable channels just due to the sort of open nature of the RSS and audio ecosystem. So it is surprising that still brands are uncovering sort of the power of the data and insights that are available.
One webinar at a time. We're going to make sure we change the understanding in the industry for sure. And maybe just to kind of give you a sense as to like what the advantage truly is to measure things with pixels. I think the way that people have thought about podcasts in the past are these sort of like tried and true cream of the crop, host read, baked in ads. We love our favorite host talking about what's going on or sort of what advertising they're representing. And oftentimes we think about how do we measure the efficacy of that? And it was typically through things like unique promo codes or survey responses. Promo codes seemingly are a pretty good way to do this, but you sort of start to remove some advertisers from consideration in terms of them potentially running in podcasts. You certainly don't see like, I don't know, Ford Automotive putting a coupon code out there. It's not very common. So it is a little bit limiting in terms of the advertiser industries that would be okay with this style of measurement. Post-conversion surveys can be a bit of a challenging thing, at least in terms of consumers. I don't think we as consumers always understand why we buy something that we're buying other than I have a need state. Why did I pick one thing or another? Is it the ad creative that was great? Is it the frequency that I heard the ad? Do I even remember that I got hit with an ad on a specific show? So those surveys are sort of like a hand raising. Yes, I heard it. I did this because I heard it on a podcast or I saw it on TV. The advantages of pixel-based attribution, aside from opening up the aperture to see more, is also that we're tracking behaviors rather than sort of attitudes towards it. And those behaviors allow us to make some better insights as to like, where should we be buying? How should we be tweaking things? So on and so forth.
Yeah. And Matt, you also require the consumer to be accountable to sort of take that action, right? If it's a vanity URL, I may remember the brand, but I'm going straight to Google. I don't remember if it was, / buy me now, or, the Cam Weber and Matt Drangler podcast. But
welcome, by the way, you're here.
Yeah, for episode 1. Same with surveys, right? You're requiring that consumer to take sort of a volunteered action. And it is validating to see that there are more promo code redemptions versus post-purchase surveys. It is likely easier for them to submit that, right? Because there's some sort of incentive. I'm getting free shipping, or I'm getting a discount off. So to see sort of that advertisers or marketers have to work less hard from a extrapolation standpoint on promo codes versus surveys does make sense to our expectations. But yeah, to your point, we're able to sort of expand that view in a sense to see sort of the holistic view of performance, whether it's visitation rates or conversion rates, not really requiring the consumer to take the directed path that the host is saying to go to this particular landing page or enter Cam Weber for 15% off, which sort of removes the burden from a performance tracking standpoint.
I'll also say too, so like two other thoughts. One, promo codes. those leak. So those get put on coupon code sites all the time. And so now it's sort of not an indication of the performance of the campaign, but maybe more of an understanding of, can people go to, I don't know, like a Retail Me Not and just find a coupon code and insert that. The other thing too is, and Cam, you and I can attest to this, you look back 7, 8, 9 years ago, and people were using a combination of promo codes and survey responses to figure out a multiplier to try and understand what was the actual effect. Cam, do you have like what are some of the biggest multipliers you've ever seen?
I worked with a brand that was trying to get into podcast attribution with, using pixel based data, and in some of those discovery calls, they were used to using like a 12x or like a 14x multiplier on redemptions. So yeah, to sort of bring parity to the digital style attribution that they were used to across other channels was sort of a game changer. But I was sort of floored that you were taking, however many redemptions and just, applying a 14x.
Times 15.
Yeah. Right. Maybe this is right.
And, like we talk about it, we laugh about it, but, there's some science that was behind it. You look at the number of coupon code redemptions and you look at how many people answered your post-conversion survey in the affirmative for the channel, you can maybe figure out a multiplier from there. But, clearly, if we start looking at the behaviors of people rather than sort of the attitudes or the self-purported attribution, you could really start unveiling some other interesting things in the data. And so this is the vantage point that sort of we come from here. Again, super high level stats, right? Pixel captures 6 times more or 4.7 times more conversions than surveys and promo codes respectively. So a very large aperture to kind of see what's going on. In a lot of ways, a slice and dice that data.
I'll also add, unless you were rotating your promo codes every month, right? That attribution window could be limitless. I could be entering something 6 months later, and that's getting credit back to a podcast that I listened to a year ago. And things like order IDs or customer IDs that can be a component captured through a pixel also allows for more specificity and like confidence that this is an actual order that I see exposed to podcasts. Am I also seeing that same exposure as another channel taking credit? So more confidence in sort of the path that consumers might take when engaging with a brand.
And we hope we prove that paid search is not the last touch channel of choice for podcast converters, although some of the data might say that in a last touch attribution model. So all of that to at the very least say, and hopefully convince everyone here, pixel-based attribution is available in the streaming audio and the podcast space. It means things are measurable, reliable, and very actionable, much in the ways that we're used to seeing for paid social, Facebook ads, Instagram ads, display banner ads, so on and so forth. And it's sort of through that lens that we release a report on a quarterly basis that takes all of the insights, or should I say all of the data, where we can derive insights and benchmarks from. I'd like to introduce to you the PPB report. Cam, maybe you can define that a little bit for us.
Yeah, and I might have leaked it at the beginning, but yeah, the PPB is an acronym for the Podscribe Performance Benchmark Report. This is something that we do on a quarterly basis. It looks at tens of thousands of campaigns, hundreds of advertisers, hundreds of publishers, and we look at the performance across all of those web-based and app-based actions. So we've got a couple of fast figures. These are sort of cornerstones of the PPP report. This is kind of an abridged version. You will see that at the bottom of this slide, there is a QR code that can take you to the fuller report that has a multitude more of metrics. But looking at some of these staples, we report on things like what are the average or median visitor rates, the conversion rates, the cost per acquisitions that we see across these brands. So just to highlight some of the data that feeds this analysis, we are looking at a rolling 12 months. So this is the past 12 months worth of data. We've got 66,000 individual campaigns, over 500 advertisers, over 200 publishers, and over 17 billion audio impressions that feed this analysis. A ton of data to compile these metrics and insights. And just to talk about some of those metrics specifically, we are seeing some stability quarter over quarter. You'll notice that some of these are highlighted red or green. Those are going to be the trends compared to the previous Q2 performance benchmark report. And looking at visitor rate, we've got a 0.25% visitation rate. The cost per visitor is a new metric in the Q3 PPB. We've got conversion rates of 0.015% and a cost per acquisition of $119. I will pause just to say that this is spreading the gamut of every sort of advertiser type. That conversion event could be for creating a free account. That conversion could also be a $5,000 couch or a car, in today's day and age. So that's why we do see sort of a higher cost per acquisition because it is including every type of brand that feeds this analysis. So we definitely encourage you to sort of we do have advertiser specific insights and benchmarks in the full report. So if you're a brand that falls in a particular industry, we'd be happy to sort of help understand sort of how your brands would perform against those benchmarks. But looking at the bottom row of metrics, we have the attributed visitor rate. So these are going to be visitors that were driven to the brand's website that actually took an action or purchase. So we've got 5.2% visitor purchase rate, a 0.14% install rate for apps, and then these last two are going to be smart promo specific conversion or listen rates. So smart promo is going to be where the podcast listen is the actual conversion. So if I was promoting our new podcast on iHeart or SiriusXM to go and listen to the Matt and Cam podcast, we're seeing a 0.55% converted device rate and a 0.42% new converted device rate. And that new converted device is going to be that household that has not listened to the Cam and Matt podcasts ever before, which would be 100%, should be aligned to the converted device rate for our anecdote or example purposes.
It's like 1 out of every 200 people become sort of a podcast consumer if you're for a specific podcast. And even too, another interesting thing, if you're looking at like visitor rate and conversion rate, right? This is where we're driving people to an advertiser's website. If I do that calculation, right, it's like 1 out of every 15 people that are led to go to the advertiser's website end up converting. That's a pretty stellar number right there. So there's a lot of interesting kind of things that kind of be discerned even just from these fast figures. And even more to sort of the point in how people think about planning media, reach is a very, very big topic for a lot of agency holding companies. There's still a lot of reach-based planning that's going on out there. And we thought that it was important to ensure that through all of this data that we have for our benchmark reports, that we start to construct what a reach curve looks like for podcasts. We believe this is the first podcast reach curve that has ever been created, and we've been sort of fine-tuning this over the last year or so. And we think that this will allow us to kind of bring podcasts in an apples to apples way with other channels that are being planned by reach, whether that's TV or terrestrial radio or even other things. Even some digital channels are still being planned by reach. And so we can kind of see here that within this reach curve and the billions upon billions of impressions that we have available to us, that at its highest reach, so when we go all the way to the right, top right of that graph, that we can hit around 130 to 135 million people on a monthly basis. So what is that? That's about a third of the U.S. population, maybe a little bit over half of the 18 plus population in the United States. A lot of people don't always think about podcasts as a reach play, but you truly can get a very, very high reach specifically within the podcast space. Now, what I would say is, where do most advertisers fall today? Sort of that bottom left-hand quadrant. But 99% of advertisers are, anywhere from the 1 to, I'd say, 300 or 400 million impressions on a monthly basis. You hit about a third of the podcast audience in that way. But you look very, top right there, it is possible to reach a very large majority of aged 18 plus in the United States. It would require a fairly decent investment, but this is not out of the realm of the larger advertisers that might look to buy a Super Bowl commercial or might look to buy, something during, let's say, high peak traffic times like holidays or even like large cultural moments like March Madness or the Super Bowl, but or the sports events, generally speaking. And so that's exciting to us. What I'll say is there's a call to action on here. If you need reach data within your reach tool, we have no interest in selling this information. We have interest in just proliferating this information out into the ecosystem. If you're looking for that data, please reach out to us. We're happy to just give you the data that is informing these graphs so you can include that information in your own planning tools. And that's for podcasts specifically. We decided that really the whole entire digital audio space is sort of underserved when it comes to looking at reach-based planning. And so we spent a lot of time sort of figuring out what is the digital audio reach in general. And here's what's interesting. I think the most interesting piece here is that the audiences for streaming audio compared to the audiences for podcasts, they don't overlap as much as we might think. They are relatively unique. They're about 80% unique when you compare sort of the Venn diagram of those audiences. And so because of that, it allows us to see what is the total reach for the combined effort of using all digital audio, so both streaming as well as podcasts. And what we find is that you almost double your reach. And we also find that you can get upwards of 85% of the US population at the very top right of that graph. So maybe a lot of people don't think about digital audio as a reach play. But this absolutely can be a reach play, especially for those larger brands that are out there that, let's say, are looking to try and drive as much awareness or brand consideration as possible. This is a great medium to do that, to reach, again, 85% of the U.S. adult population. All right, cool.
Matt,
Cam, please.
One quick question on that. Do you think just sort of the disparity between all of the different ways that a consumer can engage with podcasts or streaming audio sort of lends itself to why so many impressions are needed to sort of reach that total population, right? There's multiple different podcasting apps and multiple different streaming stations, sort of working in concert across those sort of requires a lot of impressions to reach the unique audience across the those that have a favorite, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're finding is that, first of all, we're seeing perhaps, and this is probably not a surprise to everybody, a decline in radio advertising. And what we're finding is that these audiences are kind of finding that radio fix elsewhere, and that they're kind of transitioning into streaming audio. They're transitioning into podcasts. We see more and more that even in a car, right? Like radio isn't necessarily sort of keeping stable over time. We see that there's a shift in share between listening to radio and listening to a podcast on the Spotify app or an audio book on Audible or music through Spotify or through Pandora, right? And so we're seeing this sort of like natural shift in consumer behavior and preference. And this is where they are now. So if you're looking to find what's a replacement to, let's say, take wherever my radio budget is and find places where the audiences are shifting to, this is a great medium for that. All right, Cam, over to you. Let's talk a little bit about advertiser frequency.
Awesome. Yeah, advertiser frequency is something that we have continued to report on quarter over quarter. I will say the narrative has shifted a little bit as previous reports, I would have died on the sword that an advertiser frequency of 1 is the bread and butter. This is sort of where brands need to be, of 1 ad per podcast and no more. But really, when we sort of took another look at the data, if we're using that benchmark as the benchmark, up to a frequency up to 3 is still driving both significant visitation rates as well as conversion rates. And comparing a visitation or a frequency of 3 or less compared to a frequency of 4 or greater, we're seeing 2.8 times better performance for visitation rates, as well as 2.5 times better performance for conversion rates. So on the right, you see the average frequency of 3 driving a 0.26 conversion rate. 4 plus, the average is 0.09. And then from a conversion rate standpoint, 0.02% conversion rate for a frequency of 3 or less, and 0.008 for a frequency of 4 or greater. And really, having a frequency cap in an individual podcast or show standpoint makes sense, as long as I think that creative is fresh and sort of not hammering the same ad over and over to the consumer, because that can certainly introduce fatigue. But both of those metrics with a frequency of 3 or greater at the single campaign level is really driving a stronger performance over that benchmark.
Totally agreed.
We are seeing that expanded. This is the first time we were looking at that frequency at the channel level. So highlight here is that up to 5 times per month. So this could be across shows, this could be across hosts, and the average frequency of 5 or less is driving a visitation rate of 3.48%, which is 1.5 times over the average frequency of 6 or greater, with 0.228%. Also, similar trend from a conversion rate standpoint, 0.026% conversion rate for a frequency up to 5, and 0.022% for 5 or greater. Similar assumption when it comes to that creative mix, the different voice, different hosts, having that repeated exposure over the course of the month, maintaining that visibility, that recency, that frequency to continue to drive that consumer to take an action. But this should hopefully be a well-received sort of metric from our publishers and podcasters, that there is room for more inventory. There is room for increasing that ad load and frequency when it is spanned and spread out across multiple shows or across multiple networks.
Totally agreed. It sort of helps to guidance to your advertisers too, to understand, if I'm buying an episodic ad, how many should I run? How many episodes should I sponsor at a given month, so to speak? And look at some of the other tactics that you're running, and that can kind of help start answering that question. So we find that this frequency data is, I would say, probably some of the most important metrics to look at when we're trying to run podcast campaigns, see what the performance is, and understand how do I drive even more efficient and effective performance. Frequency is certainly one of those levers that is effective in helping that. To Cam's point, right? 1.5 times better performance for average visitation rate for frequency of 5 or lower, at 1.2% better in conversions. So the trends are pretty clear there. And let's dive a little bit into buy type. Now, there's been an interesting shift that is going on in specifically the podcast space. I talked about this a little bit before, but there's this sort of, I think, immediate, perhaps we'll call stereotype on when I'm buying podcast ads. What I'm really buying is I'm buying a host-read, baked-in spot. And what that means is, and I think that's what everybody thinks. And frankly, I don't blame them, because everyone has a favorite host or a podcast that they listen to, and they want their brand sort of to be spoken by that host. And we all recognize that there's this sort of, nature of trusting that host, that there's a personal endorsement that's involved with it. All of those things are true in terms of driving performance for podcast ads. But we're starting to see a shift, because that's not the only way that people are buying podcast ads today. Another really prominent way that people are buying podcast ads are sort of non-show specific, which sometimes we call impression-based buying. And that's where you're doing things like targeting audiences, or let's say content, or let's say, there's another buy type called run of network that we talk about all the time, where you're sort of just spreading your impressions out across a multitude of different shows within a network that you're buying on. And what we're finding is the share of those style of campaigns are going up within the pie of all campaigns. And so that sort of yellow line that's up and to the right is basically saying, hey, the share of non-show specific buys is going up. It's upward of 1/3 in the last month of this benchmark report. And then the purple bluish kind of bar in there is specifically programmatic. And what we're seeing now is this sort of coming of age of the podcast space, where I think a lot of the larger enterprise publishers and some of the smaller ones out there are recognizing that there is a demand source out there in the programmatic space. And so for any inventory that we're not necessarily selling, we can plug that into a programmatic platform, right? We can push that into what's called a DSP. And now people can buy ads in a programmatic way, which frankly is kind of how a lot of, we'll say, some of the more agency holding companies or some of the other agencies that are out there are used to buying, because there's a lot of levers and knobs and things that we can tweak and turn to drive more efficient and effective performance. And more that inventory is becoming available on places like the Trade Desk, on places like the Yahoo's DSP and Amazon's DSP. We certainly have seen some prominent programmatic players in the podcast space as well, with folks like AudioHook and AdSwiz too. But we're just starting to see the proliferation of this inventory grow a lot. And we think that that's a big reason why we're seeing just generally an up and to the right growth in ad spend within the podcast space. We're just making it easier to buy. And so that's one trend that we're seeing here.
Yeah, and this just happened a few weeks ago, and I'm ashamed that after years of hammering my wife over podcasts, how incredible they are, how they work, we started a new series, and the series is years old, and a relevant ad popped up, and she's like, "How is this happening? Like, why is this podcast from 4 years ago talking about today's current events?" And the power of dynamic ad insertion, right? Unlocking inventory on some of those back catalog of shows allows for that expanded reach, because podcast listeners are not all just listening to this week's most recent episode.
Exactly. That's what programmatic ads have started to open up. Now, I think the elephant in the room here is that everyone is likely going to say, yeah, but like host-read ads, baked in, those are going to drive the best performance. And you're kind of right when you look at this on a per impression basis. On a per impression basis, we see when you buy a host-read baked-in ad, you get higher visitation rates, upwards of 50% higher, according to this benchmark, when compared to non-show specific buys. You see purchase rates double, which is a really, really big deal. But when you start looking at this, rather than on the per impression basis, but on a per dollar basis, like literally tactically what that means is perhaps programmatic CPMs are, 50% lower or 25% lower than a host read baked in ad. What we notice is that the per dollar metrics, they start to level out quite a bit. So you see return on ad spend and cost per acquired customer almost flips the script. Kind of does flip the script here when you look at it. And we see that the efficiencies on a per dollar basis really shine when it comes to the non-show specific buys or the programmatic buys. And so what it kind of tells me is, in the supply and demand curve and that invisible hand that moves prices up and down, it's doing a pretty good job at making sure that programmatic fits within this marketplace quite well. And, even those run of network ads, those non-show specific buys, they fit in quite well within this ecosystem and drive pretty darn good performance. And so that was an interesting insight that we think is important that the marketplace starts to see. And we anticipate, based on this insight, that the growth of non-show specific buys are going to continue to, we should continue to see that grow over time.
Yeah. And I think it makes sense in its current state, right? If you can think of any podcast that you listen to, Conan O'Brien sort of comes to mind for me. He's a wizard at ad reads, right? Like they are funny ad reads, and you don't even necessarily recognize that it's an ad until he's halfway through his story or his narrative. So definitely way more engaging, and as well as I'm not immediately triggered to start hitting the fast forward button to skip through the ads. So
feels content like, right?
Yeah, it does. Matt and Shane, they incorporated one of their like puns or like jokes from an episode, and that was now their promo code, versus some of the clearly sort of produced ads. I just recall when I was in Chicago doing streaming audio, listening to the Pandora app, like felt like every other ad was a O'Reilly's Auto Parts, but it was the same one. Definitely, something that I remember, right? Will stick with me forever.
That jingle will never leave your head, I promise.
No, it won't. It won't. It's very catchy. They do it well. But again, that affinity to that host is likely why we're seeing stronger visitor and purchase rates. But I do agree that with smarter targeting, with smarter data, making these optimizations, that I would expect visitor rates and purchase rates to continue to climb compared to the show specific buys. But yeah, very strong to see that the return on ad spend and cost per acquisition are such strong signals based on a number of factors, but likely that lower CPM and barrier to entry helping drive that strong performance.
Oh yeah, and by the way, so speaking of programmatic buying and optimizing to make things as efficient and effective as possible, programmatic buying opens up a lot of we call levers, optimization levers that one can pull to kind of shift and morph the buy to kind of find where the conversions are happening. So, Cam, you want to talk through some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. From a data and insight standpoint, this is where we've been talking about bringing parity to the digital ecosystem with audio. The data, the insights that are available in real time through dashboards or through reporting to see sort of the performance by things like device type. So here we're looking at a comparison between Apple iPhone and Android phones. And just running through some of the metrics, we see that 77% of all the impressions that we've tracked in this 12-month time frame have been to Apple devices, 15% to Android devices. And for those that are wondering how that adds up to 100%, it doesn't. There is a additional 8% that are happening across other devices. These could be Huawei phones. These could be smart fridges. These could be smart watches, right? There's a lot of different ways to engage with the medium. But looking at that comparison between Apple and Android, we do see a significantly stronger visitation rate, conversion rate, lower cost per acquisition. So if I was a media buyer, this is the type of data that I would be using to make optimizations on a campaign, right? I would be shifting media dollars more to Apple devices because if this is my live campaign, it appears to be driving a stronger visitation rate. And there are some assumptions that we can make, right? There's reports and research around households that own Apple devices falling within a higher household income or affluence. So maybe there's more disposable income to make non-essential purchases. But again, looking at this data, there's going to be nuance depending on what your brand, what your service is. If I was clean my Mac, for example, I'd likely want to be focusing exclusively Apple devices. If I was an Android-focused brand or service, that's going to determine who I should be trying to target from a device standpoint. But ultimately, encourage you to sort of look at this through the lens of your own performance and see if there's, if this is a lever that you should be pulling and making smarter targeting decisions on your upcoming campaigns.
Totally agreed. All right, let's dive in on by app.
Yeah, taking this a step further, we have a breakout of not only by device, but also the two dominant sort of players in the space, looking at Apple devices on Apple Podcasts, Apple devices on the Spotify app, and Android devices on the Spotify app. And similar trend here. We're seeing that stronger visitation rates and conversion rates are happening on those Apple devices, both similarly for the Apple on Spotify versus Android on Spotify. We're seeing 0.27 visitation rate compared to 0.23 and 0.018% conversion rate and 0.015% conversion rate compared to Android. So again, just another lever in the sort of toolkit for a media buyer that if I was trying to focus my impressions on the types of applications that are resonating or driving the strongest engagement, I might be shifting more to Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify when it is a Apple device.
Yeah, exactly. So, a couple of levers that one could pull while buying programmatically. And, there's probably an underlying thing that are on most marketers' minds when we're looking at some of these general aggregate level benchmarks. And that is, well, what about the creative, right? When you talk to, especially any branding folks, creative is, 60, 70, 80% of why someone decides to buy. And so, one aspect of that creative is ad length. And so we wanted to kind of take a look a little bit at what does ad length look like in terms of driving performance. And I would be willing to bet for those of us that haven't seen this insight before, this might be surprising. The longer the ad read in podcasts, the better the performance on aggregate. So we look at this where as ad length goes up, we see visitation rate go up. So that's going from left to right on the graph with the yellow bars. And then as ad length goes up, we see cost per acquired customer go down, at least if we were to draw that trend line there. And that's interesting. It's interesting because I think we as marketers, there's still this thing of there's a 6-second ad, and that's what we really need to do to make sure we're getting in front of these people, especially when, there's so much, attention grabbing stuff happening. I'm on my phone and I'm watching TV at the same time, or, maybe I'm driving and I'm listening at the same time. And there's sort of I think marketers are starting to go towards this. Hey, we need to just make sure that we're capturing attention for the full time frame. And 6 seconds is sort of where we are right now in terms of how long we can focus on any one thing. And it's not true in podcasts. It's incredible to be able to say that. And so as a potential lever for you, ad length is one of those things that seems to go very, very well within the podcast space specifically. I don't know, Cam, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, to draw a comparison between other channels like social media or display ads, where I've seen certainly interesting tactics from a attention grabbing standpoint, where it looks like there's a hair on your screen, or it looks like the ad bugged out and a pop-up or an alarm is going off, and it's purely to try and retain your attention in that 6-second cycle, where audio is completely different, right? Because consumers are electing to engage with that particular podcast, right? The level of engagement and effort that the consumer or listener has to lean into the medium tells a completely different narrative compared to display or social media. And I'll just highlight that we've looked at a few, 3 sort of different views: device, app, ad length, but there's certainly others that can be leveraged, right? Things like geo targeting, or looking at different zip codes or DMAs or states that are over or underperforming and making optimizations. Time of day, day of week, specific audiences, right? If there are now the ability with third-party audience providers to see, is it left-handed farmers in Illinois that are really resonating with this ad, and should I be targeting more of those types of consumers? That's a sort of silly example, but
I was going to say, how many left-handed farmers do you think there are in Illinois?
Probably a few. We got a lot of
6 or 7, at least 7.
At least 7. We got a lot of corn, so a lot of farmers. But, apply that to any demographic, psychographic, right? If it's households of a certain age, if it's households with multiple children in the home under a certain age, do they have a truck in the driveway and a dog in the backyard? Those are sort of the audience insights that I would be thinking about leveraging to try and reach more of those core consumers that are really responding over a certain index to a brand message.
Exactly. What we've kind of been talking about here is some of the main insights that are from our latest performance benchmark report. There's a lot more that's included, and we only have so much time on this stage before they give us the yank. So what I'll say is a couple other really quick highlights, which is, we also look at incrementality and the importance of incrementality. When we talk about incrementality in this context, what we mean is incremental purchases or conversions, not necessarily incremental reach, although we talked about reach before. And so in this instance, these insights are available within that PPB. If you want to scan that QR code, we'll show you things like, what do you expect, especially if you're a larger advertiser? What sort of incrementality should I expect in podcasting and streaming? And if I combine the two, what would I see in terms of a hit on incrementality if that were the case? We also look at things like, what are the confounding variables that change incrementality? And to not bury the lead, frankly, the size of the brand, which we measure based on unique visits per month to their website or to their app, that really determines what your incrementality is going to be. And so, you can explore that more within this latest version of the PPB. And then the last one that I'll throw out there too is, we also look at what do international benchmarks look like. We are currently measuring attribution, I would say global. There are certainly a few countries that we haven't hit just yet because the audience isn't quite there. There's a lot of podcast audience in the world. And so measuring these things and looking at what the benchmarks are looking like, I think are important for advertisers that are especially looking to expand more globally in audio. And I'll also say too, we dive into some of the challenges. There's a lot of challenges in measuring out there in, let's say, the EU or even other countries. And so we'll dive in on those within that benchmark report as well. So if you're interested, you can scan that QR code, which will be back here on the screen here momentarily. You can also reach out to us and you can ask us questions about how that works. So partnerships@podscribe.com, we're more than happy to talk you through that kind of stuff. But now I'll throw it to you, Cam, and you can kind of round us out and maybe remind us, what did we talk about here today?
Yeah, some of the key takeaways, again, we're seeing that decrease of single show campaign buying with the adoption of run-up networks, with programmatic buys. That trend is I think going to continue to climb. I'm interested and curious to see sort of where we're at in the next 12 months. If we're on track to sort of meet or exceed those single show buying strategies. That sweet spot, again, from a frequency standpoint of up to 5, certainly something that advertisers should be considering when it comes to their media mix, to the strategy of how they're organizing the specific shows that exist within their media plan. Again, from a previous benchmark report, we would have been reporting, try and keep that frequency as low as possible to get in as many unique ears as possible, but really looking across the channel. That helps broaden the horizon of like what is really working at driving a strong visitation or conversion rate, and should consider increasing that if you're limiting it to 1 or 2 times per month. From a device standpoint, we are seeing that iPhone users are converting 30% better than Android users. So if you are doing any of those programmatic or impression-based buys, definitely something that you should be looking at when it comes to optimizing or focusing your targeting. And then, this first combined view of podcast and streaming audio reaching north of 85% of the total adult U.S. population. I know we don't have it in this report, but from a monetization standpoint, we see that podcast is pretty significantly under monetized compared to other channels, right? CTV, TV, radio, social. So there's, I think, a lot of room to grow, and there's a lot of audience to reach and acquire when it comes to the combined view of podcast and streaming.
I think the stat that I've seen is something like 24% or 25% of people's media consumption is ad-supported audio, and budgets are at about 8%. So there's definitely, to your point, Cam, there's a lot of room to grow there, and it's something that we've talked about a lot. Well, what I'll say is, first of all, Cam, it was a pleasure to share the stage with you. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for coming to Cam and Matt's first podcast.
Thank you.
And what I'll say very quickly here is, again, if you want to download the full benchmark report, see all the insights that we have to offer, you can go ahead and scan that QR code. And you can download that today. Also, if you just want to talk to us a little bit more, if you want to ask any questions about podcasts, want to ask questions about how we came to some of these insights, you want to challenge some of these insights, we actually love that. We love to hear people say you're wrong. It makes us think a little bit harder about the things that we're bringing to this marketplace. And it makes us ensure that we're thinking about things the right way. So please don't hesitate to reach out for any and all reasons like that. You can find us at partnerships@podscribe.com. And to that note, I'll go ahead and open things up for questions. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask within our Q&A. And again, you can reach out to us at partnerships@podscribe.com. But I don't know, Natalie, if you want to close us out, maybe let's read through some of the questions that we've got.
Yeah, sounds great. Matt, Cam, thank you both so much for the presentation and those insights. Honored to help get the band back together and manifest this first podcast for you.
Thank you.
We are now ready to open up the floor to your questions. As a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, all you have to do is type your question into the Ask a Question text area and click the send button. Lots of questions coming in, but I'd like to start with this one. It says, we've been hearing about the rise of video in podcasts, as in podcasters who are dropping the audio of a podcast at the same time a video is getting uploaded to YouTube. What are your thoughts on this and any insights you can share?
Cam, you want to take a stab? This is a great question. You want to take a stab at it first? Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, the video component, we refer to it, and I think the industry refers to it as a simulcast, where there's both, I'm publishing my audio portion that goes to Apple, to Spotify, where consumers can listen, but I'm also uploading to YouTube or Rumble or Spotify video. And that rise has been on the rise for the past 12, 18 months as more podcasters are adopting video. I will say the challenge comes around the actual measurement. These are environments that are kind of walled gardens that don't allow for the individual IP addresses or the same signals that we would get from audio to be captured. So we do have probabilistic and methodologies to extrapolate performance on video, but I think video is going to continue to rise. I consume most of my podcasts when I'm sitting at my desk and have YouTube pulled up or Spotify pulled up. But yeah, the challenge is around measurement, and I think if we can rally brands to make the request to those large entities that sort of hold the keys, maybe there's a world where we can bring parity to measurement, but I think it's going to take a concerted effort.
I think I agree with all of that. The other thing that I'll throw out there is video is sort of synonymous with podcasts at this stage. There's this interesting debate going on in the audio and specifically the podcast industry, like literally asking the question, what is a podcast? It seems like that should be so simple to answer. But boy, it is a hotly debated topic. And, whether one body or another body says something, what we hear from consumers is it's people having a conversation, whether that's audio or whether that's video. It's a big reason why we're like, hey, it's the Cam and Matt pod. Thank you, Natalie, for being a guest host as well. But it's like the Cam and Matt podcast going on right now. So yeah, video becoming much more prominent, at least in terms of the content that's being created, because the audiences are there. And we probably all saw this stat, and if you didn't, this is a really important one. YouTube now reports 1 billion people per month are consuming podcast content on YouTube. So it is a very prominent thing right now in space. Good question.
Certainly makes sense. And thank you so much for those insights. I have another question that came in from the audience, and I would love to ask you, are there any particular advertiser industries who are seeing the most success?
So yes. And these are some of the advertiser industry. Sorry, I'm breaking the fourth wall there and showing you this slide. But these are some of the advertiser industries and the breakouts that we kind of help to provide within this benchmark report. And the benchmark report kind of sees things like retail seems to kind of get the most success, at least in terms of driving the most efficient and effective purchase rate, pretty good on visitation rate, but also the lowest in terms of cost per acquired customer and cost per visitor. So retailers do a really, really good job. An interesting honorable mention are sort of those like gaming or gambling apps. So the FanDuels and the DraftKings and Underdogs of the world. And they're starting to find a lot of success there, primarily because of programmatic campaigns. When we think about like, how does a host read baked in ad work? Every single person downloaded the podcast gets the same ad, whether you're in a legal state for gambling or not. And so programmatic at this stage right now allows us to do the targeting, the geo-targeting that's necessary to really see some of these gaming brands work really well. But I'm not going to sit here and go through all of them. But what I will say is this is a great time to download the benchmark report if you want to see some specific audio advertiser industry insights. It's all there. So yeah, great question.
Yeah, very interesting. Let's go to the other side of the coin. We got a question about someone who seems to be brand new to buying. So they asked, if someone is brand new to buying, what would be a good approach to starting?
Good question. Cam, you want to touch on that?
Happy to take that. So I think depending on your budget and depending on sort of what DSPs or platforms you're working with, taking that run of network or programmatic approach to cast a wide net and see what rises to the top. Taking all audiences available, all shows available, and extracting some of those insights, like we saw previously, that there's going to be certain devices, there's going to be certain apps or audiences or individual shows that you weren't necessarily thinking about running with, but has an audience that is really resonating with the ads and creatives that you're running. So I would say cast a wide net. Also, there's a ton of great resources online, as well as industry reps that are great sounding boards. So reach out to your publishers, reach out to, if you're working with an agency, to pose this question of how can we get our first steps into podcasts? And I would say programmatic or run of network may be a great way to dip your toes into the ocean of audio.
I think we have time for one more question that came in from Tim. And he's asking, what has been the most effective ad type on podcasts? He offers up mentions, display, video ads, etc.
Yeah. So the first thing that I'll call out, I love that you asked, like, what are the best ads for podcasts? I do want to make sure, Tim, that I'm understanding the question, though, which is, are we asking what is good at driving podcast downloads? Or are we saying, what are the companion media types that help podcasts drive even more efficient and effective performance? And I can kind of help maybe address this a little bit on both sides. But I don't know, Tim, if you want to throw out a comment there. But what I'll say is, first of all, if we're trying to drive podcast downloads, what I found is podcasts in and of themselves are a really great medium that drive downloads of other podcasts. Let's say you're trying to drive audience extension or audience reach or something to that effect with your existing podcast by buying ads or bartering with another publisher to drive audience. And what I've seen is that alone is not the only way to grow your audience. You should absolutely be thinking about multiple touches and multiple channels. And some of the ways that I've actually seen the most success for podcasters themselves at driving growth is specifically at like I want to find whatever my niche is. I'm going to go find all the mailers or the trades out there that exist that are specific to that niche. And I'm going to buy some ads there too. And so podcasts in and of themselves, that shouldn't just be a single channel tactic, so to speak, to kind of drive success there. So there's one way to think about this. Another way to think about this is for those of us that have bought on, let's say, Pandora, they have companion banner ads. For those of us that are buying on Spotify, they have a lot of display and video ads as well. And I've got, in my background, I spent about 2.5 years at Spotify, and we did a lot of interesting research around what is the benefit in terms of performance if we start coupling, let's say, podcast ads with a video ad and with a display banner ad. And we saw hands down that leveraging all of those tactics together is much better than one single individual tactic. So we could dive in on that more. Again, I have a feeling that we're probably going to get the yank here pretty quickly, but Tim, if you got more questions on that, please feel free to reach out. Again, partnerships@podscribe.com. We'd love to talk to you more about it. There's a lot of nuance to this, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and I would also just quickly add that from a ad standpoint or placement standpoint, we do see pre-roll and mid-rolls are stronger performer, right? The earlier in the episode that you can run those ads, the better, just because engagement, as well as there's not a lot of insight into the full listen through of did they actually make it to the 55-minute mark of the podcast where my ad was running. So the earlier in that episode, typically the better.
Perfect.
I have a feeling that the email you gave out is going to get a lot of inquiries, even though we don't have time for more questions today. Everyone does know how to get in touch. Matt, Cam, thank you both so much for joining us today. And thanks everyone who attended for joining us for Ad Age's custom webcast sponsored by Podscribe, and of course, Matt and Cam's first webcast. Few reminders before we depart. You can view and listen to this presentation on demand using the same link you used to attend today. You will receive an email as soon as the archive is ready. On behalf of our guests with Podscribe, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time.